Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
And here for another conversation about poetry. Now, as I recall last week, we pretty much completely failed to define what poetry was. So this week, I'm probably not going to tell you how to write a poem, in keeping with our theme. I will discuss writing poetry, however. Now, as I said last time, my approach to poetry is very personal. Everything I know about poetry, apart from a few old English classes, is mostly taken from my years in slam poetry. So I did performance poetry and I did competitive performance poetry. So I've trained myself to do poems that are sharp and concise and short and to the point, the kind of thing that grabs an audience's attention. Slam poetry can be very fiercely competitive. But the things that I learned in that are applicable to a lot of other kinds of poetry too. So we are having a poetry contest this month, April 2021, at the Woonsocket Harris Public Library. Everyone is welcome to enter. And we have prizes in different age groups, so pretty much anyone can enter it. And we want as many people to enter it as possible. And what I'd like to do is encourage people to write poetry, because basically anyone can write poetry. If you want to do something artistic, and you want to, play the piano or become a sculptor, that can take years of practice. Writing poetry doesn't take that long. If you want to write a novel, it takes you years to write a novel, even if you have a really good idea for one. But you can write a poem that's really less than a page long and be really say something really sharp and interesting with it. I want to encourage people, particularly young people, to write a poem that changes people's lives, poems that change the world. But I don't want to put pressure on you either. You don't have to write a poem that changes the world. It'd be really nice if you did, but feel free to start out small. So if you want to know more about poetry, there's tons of places you can go. There's millions of poems online that you can read for free. Reading other people's poems give you an idea of how poems are structured, how poems work. You can study how poems work, the different rhyme patterns and the different beats that you can use and things like that. But you don't have to worry about things like that. You can do free verse, most people do, especially when you're starting out. You can make your poem rhyme if you want to, but you're under no pressure to actually make it rhyme. I know very few poets, apart from hip-hop poets, who actually try to make things rhyme. And the reason for that is, once you start working with a rhyme, you discover that you start twisting the meaning of your poem to match the rhymes you've got in your head, rather than twisting the rhymes to match the meaning of your poem. So you wind up derailing what you're trying to write by trying to make it rhyme. So don't do that. Just don't worry about rhyming. If you can, great. If you can't, again, no pressure. So when I say you have everything you need to start writing a poem, you don't need a quill pen, you don't need octopus ink and pure white vellum. You can write it on a piece of paper and pencil. I do a lot of my writing in pencil, that way I can erase really easily. You can type it on a computer, it's just fine. I do a lot of performance poetry. Like I said, I know people who start a poem verbally without writing it down. I once wrote a poem in my head while I was shelving books at another library. And I was afraid I'd forget it, so I kept repeating it to myself over and over again in my head until I could take a break and write it down. But that's me. What you need to write a poem is you have to have a point of view and a way to communicate. I'm assuming everyone has a way to communicate, that you can talk or you can write. I've seen poems done in sign. Some people don't speak English. Unfortunately, we can only really accept poems in English because we have no judges who can adequately judge it. So we are ill-equipped to deal with things that aren't in English, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't express yourself. So when you say you have a point of view, every single person is unique. We all have our own way of looking at the world. So you have a way of seeing things. You have thoughts in your head. And you have thoughts that no one else has, because frankly, you are unique. I can say this all the time, and I'm never wrong, because everybody is unique. That's the one thing you can always say. I hear young people come to me all the time, and they say, my parents don't understand me, my teachers just don't get it, and that kind of thing. In a lot of ways, they're right, because adults are older and you're a kid. So you see the world through your eyes, but poetry is a way you can take your point of view and bring it out to the public so adults can see it too. You can talk about things in a poem you might not be able to talk about comfortably in normal conversation. I am the judge of all of the middle school and high school poems that come in. We've had years where we had hundreds of poems, and the range of them is really amazing. Many of them have the themes of communication that they can't get through to people. People in the high school, I walk past them in the corridor every day, and they don't know who I am. And they feel that way about their teachers, their parents frequently. I've had people write about sexual assault. One person wrote a poem in which she discusses ending her own life. And she won that year, and I wanted her to read it at our public reading that we had that year. And she said, "My parents are in the audience. I'm not sure if I can read this." And I said, "Well, is it something you want them to hear?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why don't you try it?" And she did read the poem. I don't know if it changed anything in her life, but poetry can change lives.
Definitely would have created the opportunity for that.
Yeah, it opens things up. Poetry, I've sometimes said, is an idea that comes from one person's heart directly to another person's heart. You don't have to analyze a poem. If you want to get really, really super good at writing a poem, you can analyze it. You can also analyze it to death if you want to. The book, The Ode Less Traveled by Stephen Fry, is a book about how to write poetry. And Stephen Fry is very intelligent and extremely talented. And he's made a real science out of poetry, which is fantastic. If I was still active in the poetry scene, I could gain so much from reading that book. But you don't have to do that. Something that comes from the heart has a lot of raw emotion to it. Because the other book that I brought on display is written by middle school kids. And they're all really short poems.
You said written by middle
Written
school?
by middle school kids, yeah, just like the kids they submit to me. I feel free to flip through that. It's really good.
Very cool.
Yeah, they're all really short, and none of them are going to change the world, but they're all about, most of them are about very real, very raw emotions.
Dressing for PE.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big one, yeah.
No privacy in the locker room.
Yeah.
All right.
You may think that things that happen in your life aren't worth writing about. Like Bill said, "I have nothing to write about." And yet, again, you are unique. You're seeing the world through your own eyes. You can't assume that everybody else knows what you're thinking. Things that happen in your ordinary, everyday life, it can make really good poems sometimes. All art is about communication. So this gives you the chance to communicate ideas. And poetry gives you a form to do that, a way to structure ideas. So the first thing you need to write a poem is something you want to write about.
Okay.
If you have something you really love or you really hate, that could be a good starting point. One poet said, write about things that make you off balance. Things that, because when you're off balance about something you don't feel right about, so you have to stop and think about it. And in thinking about it, you're analyzing it, no matter what it is. And that gives you fodder for writing a poem, because you've already thought about it. I get lots of poems about high school crushes and bullies and that kind of thing. Again, that happens to everyone. It's universal, but it's also personal. Things you write that seem very intimate will sometimes wind up being universal in ways that you don't expect. I can't tell you how many times I've written a poem that was very deeply personal to me about things that happened to me in my life. And I come down from the stage and someone says, "I know just how you feel." And that's not bad, that's good. So the things you have that are deeply personal are sometimes things that other people want to hear. They don't have to be embarrassing things when I say deeply personal. I mean things that you feel really strongly. You should be brave, you should confront your feelings, and you should be honest with yourself. Sometimes teachers give writing a poem as a classroom exercise, and kids wind up writing poems about pizza or poems about ice cream or something like that. And that can be fine, actually. Some of them can be funny. Some of them can be kind of fun. but they're not deeply passionate poems because they don't really love pizza that much.
I beg to differ on both counts, pizza and ice cream.
Yeah. You can write great poems about them, I guarantee it, but the kids are generally thinking of the first thing that comes into their minds, which doesn't always make a good poem.
So actually, that's kind of interesting because I tend to do a really self-destructive thing. I eat my emotions. And so in fact, you could take, for some people, you could take pizza and ice cream and really pull out some internal...
You could do a very powerful poem about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So when I say be brave and be honest with your emotions, that's something you would have to confront in yourself if you wrote that poem. The poem would force you to think about it.
Yep.
I could easily see that as being a powerful poem that would really move people. Because again, the way you look at things is your own.
Right.
The person looking at you could never possibly guess that. So you write down your feelings about something. Write it down in a way that's as sharp and concise as you can. And then you keep honing it. You keep focusing it more and more like a laser. Take out the extra words.
No, we understand what concise means, but when you say sharp in this context...
Use strong words rather than weak words. You don't feel love about someone, you're passionate about them. Passionate is a strong word. Love is kind of generic. You can love anything, but how many things are you passionate about? Try to use words that are stronger rather than weaker. Use evocative words, words that evoke emotions, words that evoke the senses. When she said goodbye to me, it felt like someone hit me in the chest with a sledgehammer. I've never actually felt that, but I could use that in a poem. And people would know what I was talking about, that feeling you get. So try to find things that say what you want to say in the best and most powerful way possible. The more you put into a poem, the more you'll get out of it. To be proud of your poem, it has to say something that you want to say and say it well. Extraneous words, get rid of them. That's the difference between poetry and prose, is there are no extra words in poetry. Every single word in your poem has to be doing at least 5 things, or it's not working hard enough. With prose, you can go on and on about how much you love someone. You can write a whole novel about that. In a poem, you should say it in a couple of paragraphs. If you can't, then maybe you should be writing about that. Pick another topic. And there's nothing wrong with that. Pick 2 or 3 topics and find the one that speaks to you the most. I was on a slam team one time, and I had a poem that started with the line, "Her life was like a maze." And I liked my poem. I'd written it, and it was unchanged for like a year that I was reading it. And my coach at the time, Ray Davis, said, no. There are no metaphors. It's not like a maze. And so I got up there and I said, "Her life was a maze." And I'm like, oh crap, he's right. And obviously there are metaphors in poetry. What he meant was, like was an extraneous word. It didn't have to be there.
Right.
Her life was a maze. That's a much more powerful phrase than her life was like a maze.
Can you explain a little bit more? I really liked when you said each word should be doing like 5 things. So can you tell us more about those 5 or multiple things?
It's hard to put into words. If you read your poems aloud, which I do recommend once you've finished it, read it aloud. Even if you never intend to be a performance poet, reading your poem aloud will give you the rhythm of it. The words should sound like they belong together. Once you develop a pattern of like strong words and weak words, that they should match each other.
Okay.
If you've used really short words, you stick in a really long word, unless it's being done for comedic effect or something, it'll seem like it doesn't belong in that sentence.
So we want words that flow.
Yeah, words that flow from one to another. If you are going to perform it, you can put line breaks where you take a breath.
Okay.
And that'll give you a natural rhythm to your poetry. I've often said that I have no sense of rhythm whatsoever. I've joked I lost my sense of rhythm in a hunting accident when I was 12. But people have pointed out that I do have a rhythm when I do poetry, because you almost can't help it. And it's because the breaks that I put in there, the pauses, gives it a beat, whether I intend to or not. So by doing it aloud, you will see the natural beats in what you're doing, and you'll know when something sounds right or wrong. So pick words that evoke emotions, words that evoke like passion in people, words that people will easily recognize and understand. And that can be difficult. The word should have the right number of syllables to fit the sentence. It should be, again, should fit the beats of your sentence in the same way.
So you want to have on-hand dictionaries and thesauruses?
That wouldn't be a bad idea. A thesaurus is a great idea. All the stuff is available online. When I first became a poet, the internet was crap and extremely slow, so I couldn't depend on any of that stuff. There are rhyming dictionaries if you want to rhyme, and there is nothing wrong with using them. The rhyming dictionaries are great.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Again, but don't be a slave to your rhyme. The rhyme should be a slave to your poem.
So that's an interesting resource that I think maybe not everyone is aware exists. Are there other resources like that that are sort of under the radar that you can think of?
Not that I know of, but there's a billion websites. There's 10 billion websites. And there's plenty of them on there for how to write poetry.
Okay.
I've culled some of these ideas from like other people's websites that I stumbled across researching just over the last couple of days. So there's a lot of good ideas out there. Basically, your poem should fit together. Because I also write prose, I think of a poem as being like a novel. Your poem should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If it just trails off without leading anywhere, the audience won't feel right about it. Something's missing. So in a sense, you should be building up to something. If you were doing a poem about your relationship with food, you'd reach a conclusion about it at the end of that poem, good or bad. So you'd start with introducing the concept. That's the hook. You say something that will get them interested in what you're about to say.
Can it be that you intend for it to be a cliffhanger and then followed by a separate work?
Yeah, you can completely leave it on a cliffhanger. That is a legitimate ending. And the first sentence, I always try to get people interested in the first sentence. Like I said, that's the hook. Say something unexpected. I used to date a girl named April. And I did a poem about her that starts with the line, "They say April is the coolest month, but I've always found her warm and inviting." So I'm talking not just about the month, of course, but about the person that I know.
Right.
And so I started out thinking I'm talking about like the calendar, and I really talk about something completely different. So right away, that draws people's attention to the poem. And then you go into the meat of what you want to say. Right. You say what you want to say it precisely as possible. Again, get rid of extra words, use strong words rather than weak words, and you reach a conclusion in the end.
We're talking about precision and being concise. What is the longest good poem you're familiar with?
It depends, because really talented people can write huge poems. Allen Ginsberg's Howl is an amazing poem, but like it fills an entire book. Walt Whitman is a superb poet, but by our standards, he's really super wordy.
So, okay, that kind of creates a new question for me. When does it stop being a poem and become a novel? What's the difference?
It'll still be a poem so long as you put the breaks into it. They give it a beat to it. And we have novels in poetry form. I have several in my section.
Okay.
They're basically poems that become a novel because they're that long.
And it's not a book of poems. This is a singular...
It's a narrative that's written in a poetic style.
Huh.
Some people say that kids are drawn to that, not so much because of their love of poetry, but because of their love of instant messaging, which are also short, sharp, concise messages.
Right. Okay.
I'm not sure if that's true, but that kind of thing can easily be done. The length doesn't matter so long as is written in a poetic style.
Okay.
But I feel like the longer it is, the more diluted the message becomes. I like to pick a single topic about, and then just write about that. I have a poem I was working on about Adam and Eve, and at one point I had a stanza that mentioned Lilith, Adam's first wife, the ex, and I realized it's not about her. She's a fascinating mythological character, but she's actually not in my poem. She doesn't belong there. So I chopped that entire section out and later made another entire separate poem about Lilith. because I had to narrow my focus down to just Adam and Eve and their relationship.
Gotcha. Cool.
So don't be afraid to rewrite. If you think poets are all geniuses that get it right the first time, you are so very, very wrong. There are times when I've written a poem, and been satisfied with it almost immediately, but usually not. It's not uncommon for great poems to be rewritten a dozen times.
I think that's true of most arts.
Yeah.
Practice makes...
It very much is, yeah. And trimming words, adding a word here, adjusting a word if it's not quite strong enough, it happens all the time in poems.
And I mean, it's great to develop a better understanding of a variety of words that maybe you're not rotating often in your, speech. So there's no loss there.
Yeah. You're writing with your voice, but that doesn't mean it has to sound exactly the way you speak. It shouldn't sound the way you speak, because this is the way you write poetry, not the way you talk.
Cool, yeah.
So you'll learn to speak in a different style. And the more different ways you learn to communicate, I think, the better it is for you.
Which also is kind of interesting, because for someone who maybe struggles with not being able to sort of show up in a strong, powerful way when they want to, maybe in person, this would be a way for them to do that, on paper, and then develop that in person.
That can easily be true. It happens all the time. I know in my private life, I am really super shy.
Right.
They call it social anxiety these days. When I was a kid, it was just being shy. I have a really hard time talking to people. But when I'm performing, when I'm in front of an audience, or I'm in front of a camera, I have a much more outgoing personality. And I like performing because I like myself better when I'm on stage.
So initially, did that come natural to you, or did you develop that over time?
It happened over a period of time.
Okay.
One thing that slam poetry taught me, one of the most important lessons I learned was when I first started doing poetry in public. I've always been a writer, so I started writing poems, and I started doing them at Spoken Word in Providence. It was run by Sam Grubel. And I would get up there and I'd be really nervous. I would communicate my nervousness to the audience by the way I stood, by the way I talked. I wasn't a powerful or dynamic speaker. The audience could look at me and know that I was nervous, and they liked me. They were a very appreciative audience. But is that how I want them to think of me? Do I want them to think of me as the nervous poet who doesn't really know what he's doing and feels like he shouldn't be up there? Even though I really felt like I shouldn't be up there, was that the message I wanted to give?
So nonverbal cues, and I'm sure we have books.
We all have them, yeah. When I looked at the slam poets that I liked, they compete, so they have to just nail an audience. Like the second they walk on stage, bam, they're performing. And they're really good. But knowing them in person and being backstage with them, they're just as shy and awkward and nervous as everybody else in the world. They just put on a show when they know people are watching them.
So some of the listeners might be new to poetry. Some may not be, though. And for those who aren't and who maybe are having the opportunity to speak their poetry in person, can you recommend any books that we might have here that, again, can make them more aware of their nonverbal cues? Or you mentioned, acting, learning to read the crowd, or, like you mentioned being nervous and how you didn't want to portray that unless, of course, you do intentionally.
You could do that in a poem.
Right.
Yeah.
So do we have any books that would help a listener who is, has written a bit of poetry and maybe wants to learn how to perform it better?
Basically, the same things that they tell you in speech class, the same things they'll tell you if you take a drama class, work with doing poetry or anything else when you're in front of an audience. Keep your shoulders back. Keep your head up as much as possible. Make eye contact with the audience, or make eye contact with a spot in the wall above the audience's head so they think you're looking at them.
Right.
If you really don't want to make eye contact, feel free to nod and only pretend like you're making eye contact. They'll never notice. Yep. But basically, it's self-confidence. Once you learn to fake self-confidence, you'll have the whole world at your feet. I used to ponder, half my life I spent pondering, why do some people just have this charisma about them? And eventually realized, they're completely faking it. They have no more self-confidence than I do. Some of them are worse than I am once you get to know them. But a lot of it is completely fake. And there's nothing wrong with that when you're performing, because you have something to do that's important to you, something you need to communicate, that you need to tell this audience. And so you do it the best way that you can, so you present the best version of yourself. Like I know I've said to you before, off camera, I suffer from depression in real life. But I've never really written a poem about my depression. I've written several poems about my, internal landscape. I've never written a poem about depression because there's way too many poems about being depressed. It's a huge topic, especially with high school kids. And I didn't want the reputation of being the depressed poet.
Okay.
I didn't want anyone to look at me and think that about me.
Mm-hmm.
And since there's so much more to me than that, I contain multitudes, as does everyone else. I didn't have to focus on that one aspect of myself. I could bring out other things about myself that I wanted them to know that were equally important, more important.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if pretending I'm not depressed actually helped me get over my depression. It certainly didn't hurt.
I would venture to say it helped. Certainly.
Yeah, I can't say. I mean, I think poetry can help the poet. It can help the audience.
Yeah.
It can make people think things they've never thought before.
Well, you're analyzing, what you have going on internally.
Yeah.
So certainly it's a form of therapy.
It makes you think about yourself.
Yeah.
To write a good poem, you have to be honest with yourself and then be honest with an audience. And that can be really difficult.
Right.
The person that did the old spoken word used to call reading poetry in public getting naked.
Yeah.
Because you have no defenses. You're bringing something out that's really a private part of yourself into the public.
Yeah, just entirely vulnerable.
And you shouldn't be afraid of that because it can help you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Any closing thoughts?
Just that I love what you said. I mean, it has so much, it can be such a great thing for mental health.
Yeah, and I don't want anyone to think I can't write a poem. You can write a poem, and it might not be a great poem. There's nothing wrong with writing a poem that's mediocre. The first time you try something, you'll always be pretty bad at it.
Absolutely.
If it matters to you, the more you work at it, the better you'll get.
Yes. Yep.
All right, and that's more than all the time we have. So we'll be back next time. Until then, I've been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you then. Until then, be safe.